Chapter 38. Lord Spittleworth Comes to Call. Ma Grunter was one of the few cornucopians who'd grown richer and richer in the last few years. She'd crammed her hovel with children and babies until the place was at bursting point, and then demanded gold from two lords who now ruled the kingdom. These days the orphanage was a thriving business, which meant that Ma Grunter was able to dine on delicacies that only the richest could afford. The children inside the orphanage sported many cuts and bruises because of Ma Grunter's drunken temper. Some of her charges didn't last long on a diet of cabbage soup and cruelty. While endless hungry children poured in at the front door, a little cemetery at the back of the building became fuller and fuller. But Ma Grunter didn't care. But in the 7th year of Lord Spittleworth's rule over Cornucopia, when he received yet another request for gold from Ma Grunter's orphanage, the chief adviser decided to go and inspect the place before he gave the old woman more funds. Ma Grunter dressed up in her best black silk dress to greet his lordship, and was careful not to let him smell the wine on her breath. "Poor little mites, ain't they, your lordship?" she asked him, as he looked around all the thin, pale children, with his scented handkerchief held to his nostrils. "You see how much they needs your lordship's help." Yes, clearly," said Spittleworth. He didn't like children, especially children as dirty as these, but he knew many cornucopians were stupidly fond of them, so it was a bad idea to let too many of them die. "Very well, further funds are approved, Ma Grunter." As he turned to leave, the lord noticed a pale girl standing beside the door, holding a baby in each arm. She wore patched overalls which had been let out and lengthened. There was something about this girl that set her apart from the other children. Spittleworth even had a strange notion he'd seen her somewhere before. Unlike the other children, she didn't seem at all impressed by his sweeping chief adviser's robes, nor of the jangling medals he'd awarded to himself for being regimental colonel of the Ickabog Defence Brigade. "What's your name, girl?" Spittleworth asked, halting beside Daisy. "Jane, my lord. We're all called Jane here, you know." She remembered him from the palace courtyard, how he and Flapoon would scare the children into silence as they walked past. "Why don't you curtsy? I am the king's chief adviser." "The chief adviser isn't a king," she said. "What's that she's saying?" croaked Ma Grunter, hobbling over. Of all the children in her orphanage, Daisy Dovetail was the one Ma Grunter liked the least. "What are you saying?" she asked her. "She's explaining why she doesn't curtsy to me," said Spittleworth, staring into her dark eyes, wondering where he'd seen them before. In fact, he'd seen them in the face of the carpenter he visited regularly in the dungeon, but as Mr. Dovetail was now insane, with long white hair and beard, and this girl looked intelligent and calm, Spittleworth didn't make the connection between them. "This Jane's always been impertinent," said Ma Grunter. "One of these days I'll turn her out, my lord, and she can see how she likes begging on the streets." "Oh, how I'd miss cabbage soup," said Daisy, in a cold, hard voice. "Did you know that's what we eat here, my lord? Cabbage soup 3 times a day?" "It's very nourishing, I'm sure," said Lord Spittleworth. "Though sometimes as a special treat we get orphanage cakes. Do you know what those are, my lord?" "No," said Spittleworth. There was something about this girl. What was it? "They're made of spoiled ingredients," said Daisy. "Bad eggs, mouldy flour, scraps of things that have been in the cupboard too long. People haven't got any other food to spare for us, so they mix up things they don't want and leave them on the steps." Spittleworth wasn't really listening to Daisy's words, but to her accent. Her voice carried traces of Shoeville. "Where do you come from, girl?" he asked. The other children had fallen silent now, all of them watching the lord talking to Daisy. "I come from Cornucopia, my lord," said Daisy. "You might have heard of it. It's a country that used to exist, where nobody was ever poor or hungry." "That's enough," snarled Spittleworth, and turning to Ma Grunter he said, "I agree with you, madam. This child seems ungrateful for your kindness. Perhaps she ought to be left to fend for herself out in the world." And with that Lord Spittleworth swept out of the orphanage, slamming the door behind him. As soon as he had gone, Ma Grunter swung her cane at Daisy, but long practice enabled Daisy to duck out of harm's way. Later, after they had climbed into their neighbouring beds that night, Martha suddenly said to Daisy, "You know, Daisy, it isn't true what you said to the chief adviser." "Which bit?" "It isn't true that everyone was well fed and happy in the old days. My family never had enough in the marshlands." "I'm sorry," said Daisy, "I forgot. Of course, the Ickabog kept stealing our sheep." Daisy wriggled deeper under her thin blanket, trying to keep warm. In all their time together, she'd never managed to convince Martha that the Ickabog wasn't real. Tonight, though, Daisy wished that she too believed in a monster in the marsh, rather than in the human wickedness she'd seen staring out of Lord Spittleworth's eyes.